Okay, so now we're going to discuss Chapter 1. Now, of note, Chapter 1 is a little unusual. It's very different from the rest of the chapters we're going to cover throughout this whole semester. Because the chapters we cover after Chapter 1 are very narrow in their focus. They're on one very narrow, specific topic. That's not what Chapter 1 is. Chapter 1 is essentially your overall introduction to biology and science. So, because of that, it's not as narrow in focus. And the topics we talk about in Chapter 1 are not as directly related to the other chapters as they are to each other. There's two main things that we're going to discuss in Chapter 1. The second part of Chapter 1 that we're going to talk about is basically the chapter's introduction to science and the way science is done. So this goes along with my introduction to science that I gave you. And some of it will be repetitive, like you might hear a definition about hypothesis again. But frankly, this is very important information, so repetition is good. And some of it will be new, like there will be things we haven't discussed yet, like the scientific method and what a comparative experiment is, not just a controlled experiment. Okay, but that's the second part we're going to talk about in Chapter 1. The first part we're going to talk about in Chapter 1 is about evolution. Now, of note, evolution is not the focus of Bio 1. So why are we talking about it? Well, the reason is because the only way to actually truly understand biology is through evolution. Biology only makes sense through the process of evolution. And your textbook company, which as I mentioned, is the main textbook used by all colleges and universities, thought it was so important that you learned evolution that it was essentially the very first thing they put in their textbook. Okay, so you need to understand a little bit about evolution in order to understand biology. Now, to be frank, you cannot learn evolution in one chapter or in one lecture. So take this class, pass it with a C or better, and you can go on and take Bio 2. And Bio 2 is where you learn about all the different types of organisms that are on this planet. So obviously, you're going to learn about a little bit about evolution in Bio 2. So the first about 4 or 5 chapters in Bio 2 are all about evolution. But you still can't learn everything, even in just 4 or 5 chapters. So go on, finish at Valencia, go on to somewhere like UCF or UF, and you can take entire courses on evolution, where you learn much more details about what the process of evolution is and how it works. So today it's just going to be a very brief, cursory introduction to evolution, so you have a basic idea about what evolution is. Okay, so evolution makes sense of everything we know about biology. Organisms are modified descendants of common ancestors. Evolution explains the patterns of unity and diversity we see in living organisms. Unity is similar traits among organisms, and that's explained by descent from common ancestors. Diversity is differences among organisms, and that's explained by the accumulation of heritable changes over time. All right. So what this is basically saying is that if you look at all of the organisms living on our planet, what most people very easily see, what they notice, is the diversity. You know, there's a lot of difference between a human and a mouse, or a mouse and a fly, or a fly and a worm, or a worm and a bacteria. The diversity is obvious for most people. That kind of sticks out. However, there is a shocking amount of unity or similarity among the different organisms on this planet. In fact, there is just as much unity as there is diversity. It's just it's not as obvious to most people at first glance. For example, I mentioned earlier, if you take the cell from a human, cell from a mouse, cell from a fly, put it underneath a microscope, you couldn't tell the difference. They have the same underlying structure, same components, same parts, same pieces. There's a shocking amount of unity or similarity. Okay, so I'm going to explain examples of the unity and the diversity, and explain how evolution can explain how things can be both the same and different at the same time. So nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Approximately 1.8 million species have been identified and named to date, but thousands more are identified each year. The total number of species that actually exist currently living on this planet, the estimate is between 10 million and 100 million, and we've only discovered 1.8 million. So this is kind of shocking to a lot of people. A lot of people think, well, we have been living on this planet for a long time. We study the other organisms living on this planet, so we know everything there is to know about them, which is far from true. Okay, we are discovering new species every single year, thousands of them. Now, most of them are not large mammals like a bear. Most of them are small things like bacteria, but we do discover new mammals every year as well. So we have a lot left to learn about the living things on this planet. Now, when we do discover a new species living on this planet, we want to understand them. And one way of understanding them is through a branch of science known as taxonomy. Taxonomy names and classifies species into groups of broader and broader categories. So let me explain that instead of through this text, through an example figure. So this is an example taxonomic tree of a particular species. So this species right here, which is the American black bear. Okay, and this is a taxonomic tree that describes that species, the American black bear. But just for a second, I'm actually not going to talk about the American black bear. What I'm going to talk about instead is the Mustang. And I don't mean the horse, I mean the car. Okay, so Mustang is a type of Ford. Okay, and besides the Mustang, there are other types of Fords, like Explorers, Expeditions, or different types of Fords. Okay, Ford is a type of car. Okay, besides Fords, there are other types of cars, like Hondas and Hyundais and Mitsubishis. Car is a type of automobile. And there are other types of automobiles besides cars. Besides a car, you could have a truck or a van. And automobile is a type of transportation. Okay, besides an automobile, you could have a plane or a train or a boat. So what we're doing is we're taking that thing, the Ford Mustang, and we're placing it into broader and broader categories. Mustang is a type of Ford, which is a type of car, which is a type of automobile, which is a type of transportation. Okay, so that's what we're doing with the Ford Mustang. Now, when we place it in these categories, it helps us to understand it. For example, if we know it's an automobile, okay, then we know it's not a plane, it's not going to fly, it's not a boat, it's not going to float. So by putting it into this category, we start to learn things about it. All right, so that exact same concept we do with the living organisms on this planet. So we place them into these categories that get broader and broader categories. Okay, so the broadest category is called a domain. Everything that's alive on this planet fits into one of three domains. Okay, and I'll talk the details about the domains in just a second, but for example, the American black bear is in the domain Eukarya. The next more specific is called the kingdom. So for example, the American black bear is in the animal kingdom. Okay, so the domain Eukarya has within it things like animals and plants and fungus, which is not like this mushroom, which is not a plant, and something you've probably never heard of before and probably never will again, called a protist. Okay, so the American black bear is in the domain Eukarya, but more specifically, it's in the animal kingdom. So by knowing it's an animal, that actually tells you a lot about it. Okay, it's an animal, it's not a plant. Animals and plants are different. Okay, so those are the two broadest categories. The two most narrow categories are genus and technically specific epithet, or we're going to call it species. Okay, so genus and species are the two most narrow categories. And then all this stuff in the middle, okay, take Bio 2. That's what you'll learn about it. We're not going to go into the details about that in Bio 1. All right. Now, when we place it into the categories, we learn things about it. Like if it's in the domain Eukarya, we know it's a eukaryote, which I'll explain what that means in just a second. More specifically, it's an animal, it's not a plant. More specific, as a spinal column, it's a mammal, it's a carnivore. So we start to narrow it down and get more and more specific until we get to the actual species, the American black bear. Okay, and the American black bear is a type of bear. Now, the other thing that taxonomy does is it gives a name to every species that we discover. For example, if you're talking to a scientist, you wouldn't call this the American black bear. What you would call it is its scientific name, which is Ursus americanus. Okay, so the scientific name is a two-name system, which is the genus followed by the specific epithet or species. Okay, so Ursus is the genus, Americanus is a specific epithet or species, so its scientific name is Ursus americanus. So everything that we have discovered, we've given a scientific name to. For example, you've probably heard your scientific name. Humans have a scientific name. We are called Homo sapiens. That's our scientific name. Or fruit flies are called Drosophila melanogaster. That's its scientific name. Now, why do we use a scientific name? Because if you're talking to a scientist, they need to know exactly which species you're talking about. Like right now, it would probably be very easy for you, even just looking at this picture, to tell the difference between the American black bear, the polar bear, and the grizzly bear. Okay, you can easily see those differences of three different types of bears. But let's say instead I were to give you three different types of fruit flies, like Drosophila melanogaster versus Drosophila simulans versus Drosophila virilis. Okay, by looking at them, even if you had a microscope, you probably couldn't tell the difference. So if you're talking to another scientist, you don't say fruit fly, you say Drosophila melanogaster, or Drosophila virilis, or Drosophila simulans, so you know exactly which species you're talking about. Okay, so that's the basics of taxonomy. Now to learn more about that, take Bio 2, and we'll go into more details. Alright, so everything that's alive, as I mentioned, fits into one of three domains. That's the broadest category. Okay, and these are the three domains. Okay, one domain is called the domain Eukarya, and that is things you're used to thinking about, like the plants, the fungus, which is not a plant, that's mushroom, it's not a plant, it's a fungus, the animals, and then something you've never heard of before called protists. Protists are eukaryotes, but they typically are unicellular. They're only one cell big. Whereas, like, animals are multicellular. They're made out of, like, trillions of cells. Okay, so one domain is the domain Eukarya. The other two domains are the domain Bacteria and Archaea. Okay, so one big difference between the domain Eukarya and the domains Bacteria and Archaea is the domain Eukarya is made out of eukaryotic cells. We're going to learn exactly what that means in a later chapter, but as a preview, kind of in summary, one way of thinking about that is a cell that does have a nucleus inside it. You've probably heard about your nucleus before. That's where you store your DNA. The DNA is stored inside your nucleus because you're a eukaryote. Okay, you're within the animal kingdom. The other two domains of life, bacteria and archaea, they are prokaryotes. And again, in a later chapter, we'll learn in details what that means, but for simplicity for today, that would be a cell that does not have a nucleus. So a nucleus is this membrane-bound compartment inside the cell where you store your DNA, your chromosomes. Okay, these organisms, they do have DNA, but it's not inside a nucleus. Okay, so that's kind of a broad categorization of prokaryotes versus eukaryotes. We'll learn more details in a later chapter. Okay, but eukarya is made out of eukaryotic cells, okay, whereas bacteria and archaea are made out of prokaryotic cells. Eukarya, things you used to think about like plants, fungus, animals, and also protists you're not used to thinking about. And then bacteria, well, that you've heard of before, those are bacteria, like E. coli bacteria or Staphylococcus bacteria. Like if you have a staph infection, that's a bacterial infection. Or the domain archaea is things you probably have never heard of before and probably never will again, honestly. Okay, so for us, for Bio 1, just know that they are prokaryotes and they're unicellular, only one cell big. Okay, so those are the domains of life. Now, within the domain eukarya, we have these different kingdoms. So how do we classify the kingdoms? For most people, it's pretty obvious to tell the difference between like a primate, an animal, and this fungus here. They're obviously very different from each other. But a lot of people, think that this fungus, this mushroom, is a plant, which they're not. They're not the same. They're not the same kingdom. So how do we actually differentiate them? Well, one way is based upon how they get their nutrition, how they get their energy or their food. So domain eukarya has 3 multicellular kingdoms: plants, fungus, and animals. Okay, so how do we separate them? Well, plants, okay, they do not eat. They make their own food through the process of photosynthesis. Okay, so we're not going to learn exactly what photosynthesis is today. That's an entire chapter later. I believe it's chapter 10 in your textbook. We spend a whole chapter learning about the details of photosynthesis. But in summary, basically what happens is plants are taking the energy from sunlight and using that sunlight energy to make their own food, which is glucose or sugar. Okay, so that's a plant. Okay, how about a fungus? A fungus is not a plant. A fungus does not do photosynthesis. It doesn't make its own food. Okay, what a fungus does, it absorbs its nutrients into its entire body. Okay, it's kind of like, imagine you were to lay in a pool of food and just absorb food into your entire body. That's what a fungus does. Okay, now how about an animal? Okay, animals, like us, humans are animals, we ingest our food. We have to take our food into our digestive tract in order to get the nutrition, the energy from that food. Okay, so that's how we separate the multicellular kingdoms of the eukarya domain. Now, there is one more. Remember, that's a protist. We're not going to talk many details about protists. Just know they're eukaryotic, and they're often unicellular, only one cell big. Okay, so a striking unity underlies the diversity for life. Like I said, most people notice the diversity. They notice the differences. There's a big difference between a primate and a plant. But there's a shocking amount of similarity. Like, for example, I already mentioned more than once, if you look at the cell from a human or a mouse or a worm, you can't tell the difference. They look exactly the same. There's also an amazing amount of unity in how we store information. It turns out DNA is the genetic language for all living organisms. We all use DNA to store information. We all read that information in the exact same way. And we'll talk about that in a later chapter. There's a lot of unity in the features of the structures of cells. Okay, so an example of that, okay, this is a unicellular organism. Okay, it's only one cell big. It's very tiny. You cannot see it with your eyes. You can barely see it with a microscope. This organism looks like it has a bunch of short little hairs on its surface. Okay, those are not hairs. Those are actually called cilia. Now, if you take one of those cilia and you were to cut it in half, and you look at it under a very powerful microscope, an electron microscope, this is what you're going to see. Okay, so this is the structure inside these cilia. Okay, now if you take this cilia and cut it in half and look at it, that's what you're going to see. Take this cilia, cut it in half and look at it, it looks exactly the same. You cannot tell the difference between these two. Well, this cilia is from a tiny unicellular, only one cell big organism. This cilia is from you. You have cilia inside your windpipe. And the structure of the cilia is exactly the same as the structure of this organism that is very different from us. So there's a shocking amount of similarity among what appears to be very different types of organisms. Fossils and other evidence document the evolution of life on Earth over billions of years. Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection in 1859. In this book, he made 2 main points. First, species show evidence of descent with modification from common ancestors. And second, natural selection is a mechanism behind descent with modification. Darwin's theory of evolution explained how things can be both the same and different at the same time. All right, so I'm going to build up to explain exactly what this slide is saying. But before I go into some of those details and those explanations, let me point out that there is many common misunderstandings about Darwin among the general population. The first very common misunderstanding about Darwin is that people think that Darwin discovered evolution. Darwin did actually not discover evolution. The idea of evolution was around before Darwin. Another scientist published his hypothesis on evolution the year that Darwin was born. So Darwin was a baby. He didn't come up with it. Okay, so Darwin did not discover evolution. So if that's the case, then what did Darwin discover? Darwin discovered how evolution happens, the method of evolution, which that is called natural selection. Okay, so that's actually what Darwin discovered, is natural selection. Okay, the second point that everyone gets wrong among the general public about Darwin is, and this is going to seem like I'm being nitpicky, but they say the name of his book wrong. They say the name of his book is On the Origin of Species. That's actually not the name of his book. The name of his book is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And that second part that everybody leaves out, that's actually the important part. That's what Darwin discovered. How does evolution happen? Evolution happens by natural selection. Okay, so I'm going to build up to explain what Darwin discovered, natural selection, and what natural selection is. So Darwin was a scientist, and one of the key skills of a scientist is to make observations, to observe things in the world. And Darwin made these observations as he was traveling the entire planet, studying the organisms that are living on the planet. But you can make these exact same observations. For example, Darwin observed that individuals in a population vary in their traits, and many of these traits are heritable. Okay, well, you can easily make that same observation. Okay, for example, let's say you're around other people. Okay, in that case, you're a population of humans. You are not exactly the same as everybody else. You vary in your traits. Like some of you might have black hair, some might have blonde hair, some might have red hair, some might have brown hair. Some of you might have blue eyes or green eyes or brown eyes. And those traits are heritable. So you can get blonde hair from your parents. You can pass brown eyes on to your kids. So Darwin observed this, studying all the organisms living on this planet, but you can make the same observation just hanging out with a group of humans. Second thing that Darwin observed is that more offspring are produced than survive, so they're going to end up competing with each other. Now, this does not refer to like a mouse living protected in a science lab. This is like a wild field mouse, a mouse living outside in the wild. So in the wild, more baby mice are born than are going to end up living. Most of them die off before they survive to make their own baby mice. So since more are born than are going to survive, they end up competing with each other. They compete with each other for things like food. There is not enough food out there in nature to feed all the baby mice that could be born. So if one mouse goes along and finds a piece of food, it eats that food and it lives for the day. But now that food is gone, so the next mouse can't find that food, so the mouse starves and dies. Okay, they're also competing with each other for things like protection from predators. There are things that want to eat mice, like hawks want to eat mice. Okay, well, if one mouse finds this great little hiding spot so the hawk can't see it, it's protected and it lives for the day. But now that hiding spot is taken up, the next mouse can't find it, the hawk sees it and eats the mouse. Okay, so since more are born than are surviving, they end up competing with each other. Okay, so Darwin observed this, studying all the animals living on this planet. You could, if you wanted to, go out into nature and you could observe the same thing happening as he observed. Third thing that Darwin observed is that species generally suit their environment. In other words, it seems like things are very well adapted for where they happen to be living. Again, you can observe this yourself. Let's say you go take a walk out in the woods in Florida. And as you're walking out in the woods in Florida, along hops a little bunny rabbit. Okay, that bunny rabbit is going to have brown fur. Why is it going to have brown fur? Because the brown fur very nicely matches the leaf litter on the ground of the woods of Florida. In other words, it's harder to see that rabbit. And it's not just harder for you to see that rabbit. Rabbits have predators, like hawks want to eat rabbits. It's harder for the hawk to see that rabbit. Okay, now if there was a white rabbit hopping around the woods of Florida, it would very easily stick out. It would be easy to see, not just for you, but for the hawk that wants to eat it. Now, go to a different environment. Let's say you go up to Alaska, where it's a very snowy background. What type of rabbit are you going to find? A white rabbit. Why? Because the white fur very easily matches the white snowy background of where it's living. What are you not likely to find? A brown rabbit hopping around in the snow. So, Darwin observed that species generally suit the location where they're living. You can see the exact same thing. So, from these observations, Darwin made some inferences. Darwin inferred that individuals are best suited to their environment or more likely to survive and reproduce. So over time, more individuals in a population will have the advantageous traits. Evolution occurs as the unequal reproductive success of individuals. In other words, for example, okay, in Florida, the brown rabbits are more likely to hide from the hawks. The white rabbits are more likely to be seen by the hawks. That white rabbit is eaten, so it can't make more baby rabbits with white fur. So over time, you get more and more brown rabbits in Florida, more and more white rabbits in Alaska. In other words, the environment selects for the propagation of beneficial traits. Darwin called this process natural selection. That is all natural selection is. And that's what Darwin discovered, and that's how evolution happens through natural selection. But let me explain natural selection one more time through one figure. Natural selection is one of those things that I think people are overthinking. They think it's more complicated than it really is. You can honestly understand natural selection fairly easily in just one figure. Okay, so for natural selection to happen, you need some things. First, you need some population. For example, let's say you have a population of beetles. Okay, second, that population has to vary in some heritable trait. You know, like we vary in our hair color, brown hair, black hair, red hair, blonde hair. And that trait is heritable. You can pass it on to your kids. Well, these beetles vary in the shade of their shells. Some of them have darker shaded shells, some have lighter shaded shells. And they can pass that trait on to their kids. This lighter shaded shell is going to have baby beetles with lighter shaded shells. This darker shaded shell is going to have baby beetles with darker shaded shells. Okay. Third thing you need is you need that population to be living somewhere. They have to be living in some environment. So let's say in this case they happen to be living in a very dark colored environment. Okay, the next thing you need is some selective pressure. Something that's going to act upon those traits. In this case, that's going to be a bird. Okay, why? Because birds want to eat beetles. Okay, now imagine in your head for a second that you are a hungry bird and you are flying around looking for some food. If you're flying around looking for some food, you're not going to pass a piece of food that's easy to find in order to find a piece of food that's harder to find. Why? Because you're hungry. You want to eat. You don't want to starve to death. Okay, well, for this bird, the lighter shaded beetles are easier to find. They stick out more. The darker shaded beetles are harder to find. They hide better. So what happens is a higher percentage of the time, the lighter shaded beetles get eaten. Well, if this beetle is eaten, that means it's dead, which means it can't pass on that lighter shaded shell to the next generation. Whereas this darker shaded one survives, which means it can pass on the darker shaded shell to the next generation. So what happens is over time, you get less and less of the lighter shaded shells, and you get more and more of the darker shaded cells. So over time, the population becomes darker and darker shading, better matching its environment. That is all natural selection is. Okay? It's very logical. If you think through it, it makes sense. It's not hypothetical. Okay, you can directly watch natural selection happen. You can see it happen before your eyes. Okay, we have directly observed natural selection. Okay, so that's all natural selection is. And frankly, that's all evolution is. All evolution is natural selection over a very large time scale. Okay, so with more and more time, you can get bigger and bigger changes to the organisms. It's very easy to directly observe natural selection happen. You can see it happen right before your eyes because it can happen, over just a generation or two. It's a little more challenging to directly observe evolution happening because normally you need much larger time scales. But we have directly observed evolution happening over species that reproduce very quickly, for example, bacteria. But even though you might not think of evolution as being as easy to directly observe, there is an overwhelming, enormous amount of evidence for evolution. Thousands and thousands of pieces of evidence for evolution, and this evidence comes from many different fields of science. People tend to think evolution is fossils. Evolution is not just fossils. That is one form of evidence for evolution, but there's lots of different forms of evidence for evolution. So studying the fossil record is one type, comparative embryology is another type, comparative anatomy is another type. And then there's much more modern forms of evidence for evolution, things that Darwin never would have known because it hadn't been discovered yet scientifically. For example, comparing genomes, comparing DNA sequences, you can see the evidence for evolution. Or comparing protein sequences, you can see the evidence for evolution. So there's an overwhelming amount of evidence for evolution. There's so much evidence, I can't explain it to you all in one short little lecture. And some of the types of evidence you would need to be in a higher level science course before you could fully understand it. Like if I tried to explain to you how you can document the evidence of evolution by comparing genomes, genes, I'd first have to teach you exactly what genes are and how genes evolve, which you're not there yet. But I would like to leave you with a couple of more easy to directly understand examples of evidence for evolution. So, for example, let's say that I were to tell you right now you're not taking a biology class. Let's say right now you're taking an engineering class. And I, as your engineering professor, tell you for homework, what I want you to do tonight is I want you to go home and I want you to design from scratch a leg that's meant for walking, and an arm that's meant for lifting, and a wing that's meant for flying, and a flipper that's meant for swimming. Okay. As an engineering student, if I were to tell you to design those 4 different structures from scratch, you would design them very differently. Because the physics of walking is very different than the physics of lifting or the physics of flying. So if you were designing from scratch those 4 different appendages, you would design them completely differently. However, if you look at those 4 different appendages, they have the same basic bone structure. Okay, there is one long bone here, 2 bones here, a set of wrist bones, a set of hand bones, a set of finger bones. And it is the same set of bones, whether it's an arm, a leg, a flipper, or a wing. Okay? There is no reason to have the same underlying structure if you are designing these structures from scratch. The reason that they have the same underlying structure is because they all descended from a common ancestor that had that basic bone structure. Now, over time, as you're an organism that's moving from walking on the land to swimming in the oceans, you can imagine it would become advantageous to get longer and longer finger bones to make a bigger flipper to make it easier to swim. Okay? Honestly, this is the exact same idea as the darker and darker beetle shells over time. It's just longer and longer finger bones over time. Okay, so that's the reason we have the same underlying structure in all of these, is because they descended from a common ancestor that had that same structure. If you were designing it from scratch, you would not design it that way because they do very different things. So another fairly easy piece of evidence to directly understand, speaking about whales for a minute, Okay, I'm sure all of you know what a whale is. It's that large creature that lives in the ocean. Most of you are probably also aware that whales are not a fish. Whales are a mammal, meaning that they breathe air, they produce milk, they have hair. They're warm-blooded, whereas most fish are cold-blooded. Whales are not a fish, they're a mammal. Okay, now I think that most of you also realize that whales, being those large creatures that are swimming around in the oceans, whales don't walk. They don't need legs. They don't walk. They have no purpose for legs. They don't walk. Everyone, I'm sure, agrees with that right now. Whales swim. They don't have legs. However, if you look at the skeleton of a whale, it has the remnants of legs. It has remnants of a pelvis and a femur. Okay, these bones, they do not do anything. They are completely useless. The pelvis doesn't even attach to the spinal column anymore the way your pelvis is attached to your spinal column. They're completely useless. There's no point in them. There's no reason for these to be here, except that the whale is a mammal. The whale, being a mammal, evolved from something that used to walk on the land. Okay. Well, as the organisms over evolutionary timescale were transitioning from walking on the land to swimming in the oceans, it became a disadvantage to have a leg hanging there that you weren't using. This leg wouldn't help the whale to swim. So it actually made it harder for the whale to swim having this leg. So over time, what happened is the leg got selected against. It got shorter and shorter over time. But it hasn't been completely selected against yet. That's why you can see the remnants of the leg left over. There's no purpose for this. The reason it's there is because whales evolved from something that used to walk on the land. Okay, that's another small piece of evidence of evolution, but there are literally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of pieces of evidence documenting evolution. Okay, evolution is not a hypothesis. It's not your best guess. Evolution is a theory. It's a very well-tested explanation for a set of observations. It's been around for more than 100 years. Okay, there's an enormous amount of evidence for evolution, which we can't go into all of it in this test. Go on and take Bio 2 and then go and take whole courses on evolution at UCF or UF, and you'll learn all the different types of evidence for evolution. Darwin proposed that natural selection could cause an ancestral species to give rise to two or more descendant species. Evolutionary relationships are often illustrated with tree-like diagrams called an evolutionary tree or a phylogenetic tree that show ancestors and their descendants. Alright, so for example, one of the things that Darwin is most famous for is studying the organisms living in the Galapagos Islands. And one of the things he studied was a type of bird called the finch species that were living on the Galapagos Islands. So this is an example of an evolutionary tree or a phylogenetic tree showing the different finch species living in the Galapagos Islands. Okay, and again, we're not going to go into the details of this. If you want to learn more details of how to read this or understand this, take Bio 2 and you'll learn some more details about phylogenetic trees or evolutionary trees. But in brief summary, the farther to the left, farther back in evolutionary history, farther to the right, closer to modern time. And one of the things an evolutionary tree does is it shows you how closely related two species are to each other on an evolutionary sense. For example, let's say we look at this bird here and this bird here. They are very closely related to each other. Why? Because you don't have to go back very far to find their common ancestor. Okay, so where the two lines meet, that would be the common ancestor of these two species. Now, in contrast, instead of looking at these two, let's say you looked at these two birds, they are not as closely related, because to find their common ancestor, okay, you have to go all the way back to here to find their common ancestor. So you have to go back farther in evolutionary history to find their common ancestor. Okay, but if you really want to learn how to read one of these, take Bio 2. And that is your exceedingly fast introduction to evolution, okay? This is just a really brief summary of natural selection and evolution. If you want to learn more about it, go on and take Bio 2, and then go on and take full courses on evolution. Or if you're curious about it, feel free to ask me questions, and I could try to answer your questions about evolution. You need to understand the basics of evolution in order to understand biology. But this is just a brief introduction to it.